Hello, my name is Marian Ingrams, and I am the coordinator of the OECD Watch network and also a member of OECD Watch's coordination committee. And in this slide, I'm going to talk about gender due diligence and how civil society organizations can use tools of the OECD to evaluate a company's gender due diligence. So before we get into the concept of due diligence and gender due diligence, let's take a minute to consider the fact that women and other gender or gender minorities often experience unique and potentially worse impacts of irresponsible business conduct. Just to give some examples, women workers often find themselves working in poor working conditions with lower wages, less stable contracts, and fewer benefits. Linked to the fact that they are women. Women workers often experience higher rates of gender-based discrimination, harassment, and violence at work. It's often used as a tool of suppression of workers. And women workers often have reduced access to maternal health protections or inadequate training and safety equipment, including with respect to fetal and maternal health issues. And impacts on women do not only occur to women workers, but also to women community members and human rights defenders who can be impacted by irresponsible business conduct. So, for example, women human rights defenders experience all the other adverse impacts of when engaged in their activity against the activities of multinational enterprises. That in addition, they can face greater levels of harassment, sexual violence, public shaming, attacks on their reputation or reputational smears, and even harm directed at their children and families. These are impacts that tend to be higher for women human rights defenders. And women community members who are impacted by, for example, infrastructure projects by an enterprise also have often unique adverse impacts on themselves as a result of that business activity. So, for example, they face often higher or different ways of displacement from land and resources. Women's land tenure rights are often more vulnerable, meaning that if land is appropriated for the project, they have suddenly less stable link to that land or to the resources on it. There can be higher sexual violence as a result of business activities in an area, resulting in an influx of men, leading to more prostitution as well. And often large business projects can disrupt women's social status and access to education, among other issues, in ways that are different from how men can be impacted as community members from business activity. It's also important to highlight that LGBTQ plus people can also experience gender-based discrimination, including differently or worse from business activity that they are next to. There are some statistics, for example, on workers, women workers. 80% of garment workers are women, and they are at particularly high risk of sexual harassment and low pay, for example. Approximately 75% of electronics workers in electronics producing countries are women. And in this sector, they often face maternal and fetal health risks from exposure to different types of chemicals. And it's estimated that about 40% of global agricultural workers are women, and yet they own less than 15% of farmland. So these are just examples of some of the challenges, different types of challenges women can face as workers in connection with business. So what can be helpful to help address the disparity in impacts to women is for civil society groups, including non-governmental organizations, to help identify gender-specific impacts through engagement with communities. Many civil society groups are doing this and are very aware of this. Others can themselves still learn more how to remember to focus on not only community-wide impacts, but gender-specific impacts when they are conducting field visits with communities. It can also be helpful, and something that civil society can help do, to assess whether the company or companies involved have adequately addressed those impacts to women through something called its gender due diligence. So now let's take a minute to think about what is due diligence. And I would note that we have another set of slides addressing this question, but in brief here, due diligence in the context of human rights and environment is the process an enterprise should carry out to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address actual and potential adverse impacts in their own operations, their supply chain, and other business relationships. So it's a process of identifying adverse impacts in their own activities and in their supply chains and that of their business relationships. The OECD has laid out in its 2018 due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct a helpful 6-step process for understanding the process of due diligence, starting with embedding responsible business conduct into policies and management systems. That's the first step an enterprise should take in its due diligence. The second step is identifying and assessing adverse impacts, and then once it has identified them, taking steps to cease, prevent, or mitigate adverse impacts on people or on the environment from its operations or supply chains. The fourth step is tracking the results of its due diligence mitigation steps, and communicating not only how impacts are addressed, but communicating at each step of the process what impacts it's identifying, what steps it's taking to address them, and what the results of those are. And finally, the 6th step, an important step of due diligence, is to provide for or cooperate in remediation, specifically when an enterprise has caused or contributed to the impacts, rather than just being directly linked through a business relationship. So the OECD has also given guidance on how to integrate gender into those 6 steps of due diligence, into the due diligence process. Companies are expected to conduct due diligence with a gender lens, through which companies should evaluate, identify, and address risks and impacts to women or other gender minorities in particular, and develop gender-sensitive and gender-responsive policies and plans. And more information can be seen on this in the OECD's due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct. And something that OECD Watch has done is put together a guide, which you can find on our website, giving some guiding questions that a civil society entity could ask to consider whether an enterprise has in fact implemented an effective gender due diligence process. So we have walked through the 6 steps of due diligence, offering questions to guide an assessment of whether the company has done enough. So for step 1, what would be important to find out is if the company has embedded gender into its responsible business conduct policies and management systems. So this can normally be done looking online. Does the company have a policy on promoting gender equality and avoiding adverse gender impacts through its operations, including in its supply chain? And has that policy been made public, not only to the wider public, but to rights holders, to the women or other individuals that are meant to be served by that policy? Have they seen it and understood it? That's where it's important to talk to communities to understand their insights on the gender responsive policies of the enterprise. The second step of due diligence involves identifying and assessing actual and potential adverse gender-related impacts. So even if a company is identifying adverse impacts from its operations, for example, from a large dam it is constructing in a river delta area, it would be important to evaluate whether the company has mapped its possible gender-specific impacts. Has the company, in that case example, considered how women's access to land affected by the dam will be different from men's, and what that will do to girls' activities at the home? Or has that not featured in the enterprise's due diligence scoping process? Another feature is, has the company consulted the impacted or potentially impacted women and LGBTQ plus workers or community members to learn about impacts they face? Have they specifically sought stakeholder engagement with women, not just with men or other chosen community representatives or worker representatives? Has the company really understood its relationship to these impacts on women or gender or sexual minorities? The third step of due diligence is on ceasing and preventing or mitigating impacts. So in this case, the community or the civil society organization assisting them may want to think about whether the company has ceased or prevented or mitigate specifically gender-related impacts. So questions that are worth asking are, has the company stopped and or mitigated its impacts on women? Has the company used and, if necessary, increased its leverage to influence business partners to cease, prevent, or mitigate harm to women or LGBTQ plus individuals? A way to assess this is both to look online to see if the company is reporting any of its actions around this topic, and also, as always, to speak to the impacted rights holders to understand if they are aware of any steps the company is taking to try to address high sexual harassment rates in the workplace or gender-based discrimination in promotion, just to give a couple of examples. The fourth step in due diligence is tracking implementation and results. So it's important for the company not only to take steps with respect to gender-specific impacts in its operations or supply chains, but also to report the results of its gender due diligence. So has the company reported this type of information? Are they also reporting data on their impacts in a manner disaggregated by gender? Are they acknowledging this many men, this many women are displaced, this many men are hired at this level in the supply chain operations versus this many women hired at this level of promotional status? And critically, to understand the results of their due diligence, it would be important for the company's tracking process to involve, again, consultation with, stakeholder engagement with women in particular and LGBTQ plus individuals in particular, to understand whether its mitigation or other prevention efforts are working with respect to impacts on those people in particular. Step 5 is communicating how gender-related impacts are addressed. So in this case, has the company communicated its results through all the 6 steps until all of its impacts are fully resolved? And has the company communicated with impacted rights holders directly? So again, this can be studied both through looking at the company's own sort of online or global communications about its due diligence, but also talking to impacted rights holders, women and LGBTQ plus individuals, to understand if they have heard from the company about this issue and what the company has been doing and is trying to accomplish. It's also helpful if the company is communicating with other supportive entities like civil society groups, women's groups, and unions. Is that communication line active? Is an important step in considering whether a company is meeting its gender due diligence expectations. And finally, providing for cooperating in remedy is critical, including with a gender lens, to understand, for example, whether the company has provided remedy for gender-specific impacts. If it's identified gender-specific impacts, has it taken steps to find ways to resolve that impact, provide some compensation or remediation or other solution for it, specifically for the gender element? Similarly, does the company have an internal, safe complaint system to be used by women and LGBTQ plus individuals to try to raise concerns and seek remediation or changed conduct? And does the company participate in good faith with other types of complaint mechanisms, specifically on gender-related impacts? As always here, it is important for the company to engage in meaningful stakeholder engagement with the rights holders, with women and LGBTQ plus individuals, to understand if the remedy provided is actually meeting the impacts that they are experiencing. This has been a quick overview here in slides of the ways civil society can evaluate an enterprise's gender due diligence. Here on the last slide is an image of the first page of our guidance document mentioned earlier in this presentation. Please do check it out. Measuring up how civil society organizations can evaluate a company's gender due diligence, which offers these steps to help guide communities and their advocates in evaluating a company's gender performance. Thanks.